troop presence. How do you see
that probably there was not a real willingness to, for example, include women on the table, but then just to tick that box of the international community requiring you to put a woman on the table, it probably put some pressure on our politicians here, Afghan politicians, to make sure that they comply, with certain international requirements. Now that I would say, Scott, I mean, that has certainly had its impact. I mean, as much as I've always all along called it tokenism, but I think in the bigger picture, I think it has had its impact, and having at least creating a form of a check and balance, that probably not necessarily substantial in the short term, but have had, its impact. So going forward, I think what Laurel said in terms of the monetary leverage is certainly important. There is clearly signs of appetite of intensified war on both sides, both the government and the Talib. So what's really worrying me right now, I try to imagine how would December 2021 look for us Afghans. This is not an issue of May and September. December 2021, 3 months into the withdrawal, I try to imagine how things would look like from a perspective of an intensified war. I have a feeling that with the winter coming, we will be going into a humanitarian and economic crisis. So I think I try to imagine for myself, how would the year end for Afghans? If you look at December 2021 as a milestone, and all I can see is a very bleak picture of both the situation and in terms of the intensified war and increased civilian casualties, but also a humanitarian crisis, as we would clearly notice a lot of displacement, internal displacements, hunger. The winter would be coming. There has been a decrease in the economic growth, and that will continue to be there. So I think, all of that are things that make me worry, but that also are areas that I think could provide meaningful engagement avenues for our international partners.
Thank you for that. Let me now turn to Hasib Humayun. Hasib, you've been also engaged with civil society for years in a personal capacity and an analytic capacity. So I'm interested in your views as well on Muqaddas's and the other comments about how the changes that have occurred in Afghanistan since 2001 may be affected by the Biden policy decision. And what do you see opportunities in reframing, as Muqaddas has suggested, the issue in a way that can continue to support those advances?
Thank you, Scott. Thank you. I think it's been very educational so far in terms of discussing the implications of the decision and where we are in 2021. And that date's important for all of us to underscore that we're discussing Afghanistan in the year 2021 with the advances and also, dare I say, with certain backtrackings and certain difficulties that are also a product of the past 20 years. So we need to have a more of a wholesome, zoomed out view of the reality as it is in our current state. And that I think Muqaddasa and her inference on the idea of protecting our gains and all, I think that's crucial. That's crucial. That's something that we all need to bear in mind. And for civil liberties, for rights in Afghanistan to continue to have a chance at further institutionalizing and expanding its coverage area, because that's very critical. For that to happen, I think we need to look at the totality of Afghanistan as the space within which we apply our calculations of whether we're doing well or whether we're backtracking, or whether certain advances have institutionalized or people are benefiting from them or not. And to clarify that further, I think because this has been a very heavily contested period in our lives these past 20 years, where the narratives, the information order at play was polarized, and actors on all sides continued to stay in trenches, we have lost sight of the big picture. And that's a confession, that's a realization that some of us may have come to it later than others, or maybe beginning to come to. The country as a whole, Afghanistan, while there are things that we must celebrate and take pride in their evolution in the past 20 years, there is greater recognition and greater commitment to rights and principles than ever before in our history. We also must contend with the fact that a large part of our country is in a humanitarian catastrophe. They're either living in it or they are at the brink of it. And that stems from mainly the main cause of it is continued perpetual violence, but also even the elements. We have the drought breathing down our neck right now, and that has implications for livelihoods, for how people will continue to go about their lives, and also the lack of, again, in terms of rights and liberties and things that are of concern at this point. I think somewhat we may have to take stock of the hierarchy of needs in different parts of the country differently. I think the right to life and basic security and dignity of life is something that, unfortunately, in this century, in this 21st century, in the year 2021, requires active efforts in Afghanistan. And that's a reality we can't close our eyes from, and that's the situation in large parts of the country. And around that is the lack of mobility, something that I need to flag here, because when we're talking Afghanistan, we're talking a country where basic services such as healthcare and education are hard to come by in a lot of the parts of the country. Mobility could help, but we have backtracked on the ability to actually move around because of all the contests on the roads and the polarization of the public space. And third, again, is something that I need to posit here is outside this whole protecting and gains in that frame, I think we need to be aware of how the announcements by the US administration, but overall, the state of affairs in the country is at this point more of one that must alarm rather than allow for any chest pumping or any celebration on any party's part. And that includes the Talibs. I don't think anybody out there has reasons to be celebrating anything given the state of affairs and given where things could lead. And in there, I think issues like exodus and refugee crisis, both tied to violence and tied to more livelihood concerns, all of them are pretty real and out there in front of us. And I am going to stop there on this, probably not directly answering your question, but my goal, my intention here was to sober it up a little, to again zoom out, look at Afghanistan in its totality, and that all responsible actors, I think, need to get out of their trenches.
Thanks. Let me push on part of your comments in terms of the contrasting needs and desires across Afghanistan. I know that you've worked a lot with grassroots dialogue efforts, and full disclosure, USIP is sponsoring a series of dialogues that you're participating in. So from those experiences and conversations that have happened over the past year at the more local level, how would you say that there is a contrast in views between those that are maybe closer to the conflict, or at least in less urban areas, and the political class that is considering dynamics of the talks?
So I think it is important to flag that when questions as such are asked, there's always the easy route to create too much of a contrast between what people label as Kabul or cities and the rest of the country. First thing I need to apply out there, all of it's Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. Kabul is its capital. It's 6 million people living there. That's a very sizable population. That's it has its own very distinct internal dynamics, every part of it. And while we cannot claim representation of any part by another part, we cannot ignore any, or in some ways apply a one counts and the other doesn't equation, which sometimes a lot of us are at risk of. Now, in terms of the diversity of both needs, perspectives across the country, we've run into remarkable colors around on this. And I think it is a question of how close you are to the continued violence, whether an area is besieged or more and less intractable, navigatable or not, and how much of a stress from its surrounding areas is a particular geography taking. So for example, if you're to look at Lashkargah and Helmand, and the stress that that city has had to take because of all the violence around it and because of the internal displacement situation, and also political contests over a smaller geography, because think, for example, members of parliament ought to represent the whole of Helmand, but their access now is limited to only Lashkargah. And that has that just congests the space. So overall, again, we're looking at a situation where there is variety, there's diversity in demands and in needs. Something I do need to clarify, I think increasingly, and perhaps due to growing insecurity and violence, and perhaps reasons that require some introspection, there's much greater disconnect between political Kabul, between what is inside the big blast walls versus the world outside it. That is I think that's a given right now. That's something that anybody aware of how things are discussed or things are planned or debated or brought forward in forums, how that manifests itself. So while large parts of the country, that hierarchy of need, that basic, the right to life or right to basics is at play right now, people are keen on getting access to it. I think there is a level of neglect of that in the political discourse. And there's a sense, oftentimes the discussion about it takes the shape of some of us asking the question, which Afghanistan in particular are we talking about? So there is a need to reconnect politically and level with reality, I think, across the board.
Thanks very much, Hasib. Let me now go to our other speaker, Dipali Mukhopadhyay, and open the aperture a little bit. You're an expert and analyst on Afghanistan. You're also a political scientist and have studied not just the Afghanistan conflict. So with that context, I'm kind of interested in how you view the narrative that has emerged about the need for inclusivity in the peace process, number one, but also the need for an inclusive state of Afghanistan to be successful, and contrasting that with a lot of examples of where exclusion of a group, whether it's the Taliban or women or an ethnic faction, has led to violence. How do you see the situation now, in light of the U.S. policy announcement, affecting the unity or disunity of the parties, and what's needed going forward to converge, I guess, on a common vision in terms of the state structure, rather than what has seemed to be a very absolutist argument of one winner should take all.
Thanks for it's a big and difficult question, Scott. I mean, I think there's a lot of one of the things I'll just open by saying is one of the things that has alarmed me about the rhetoric around the recent decision is a kind of divorcing of the United States and its responsibilities and interests and role in producing the current status quo in Kabul. So I think, there's a kind of argument that's being made that we did the best we could to try and get this unruly political situation under control. It's now time for the Afghans to figure that out for themselves and for us to bring our troops home. And I think that does great violence, frankly, to the facts of the origin story of this war. And part of, so in order to understand why are things incoherent and difficult in Kabul in the political scene, we have to also recognize the American role in that. So that being said, I think when you represent, as my friend Nader does, a republic in a negotiation, you're inherently in a tougher position than when you represent a narrow, ideologically minded insurgency, because you are attempting to create a coherent, unified position when you're actually managing a whole range of differences of opinion, differences of position. You can hear even from my friends Muqaddasa and Hasib, their willingness to criticize their own government for its shortcomings. And that criticism is part of what the Republic position represents, right? Because that's the form of government that it is defending. It's also, I think, important to say that the government came into the negotiations with the Taliban having had several assets or points of leverage of its own had been negotiated away by the United States, as Laurel explained in her description of the Doha Declaration. And so I think in that sense, again, it's about the government comes in with at least one hand tied behind its back. So I think for me, the role of American forces, particularly in the last couple of years, was not about the notion that the troops would somehow push the parties to achieve an agreement over these very fundamental differences that they have about the political future of Afghanistan. It was a kind of political signal to all of the parties within the country and within the region that the United States was invested in a particular system of government, not a particular leader, not a particular administration, but that the project of building a republic was one in which the US had a stake. And I think part of what that did was it signaled to other players, the opposition to the government, all of the complex set of elites, within Afghanistan, not just in Kabul, but as Hasib said, all over the country, that, this is the game in town, and this is where one's political future lies. This is where the success of one's family lies, one's communities that one represents. And the incentive then is to stay in that game rather than to defect, right? And so what the US has done by announcing an unconditional withdrawal is effectively to defect from that game. And so naturally, the tendency then becomes from all of the other parties to begin to scramble for their own survival in the context of, this kind of potential unraveling. I will say, though, for me, that I come out perhaps more optimistic than I should be, but optimistic in the sense that I hear actually quite a bit of coherence around the investment on the part of many different Afghans, elite, ordinary, urban, rural, activists, strongmen, around the value of a Republican system of government. And when you look at the last 20 years, now there is an existential threat to that system. And in a way, as Nader said, there's a kind of clarity, I think, that emerges now from the fact that the Americans have said we are leaving, which is that there is a possibility that the kind of system that currently exists, that has been of great value and benefit to many different types of Afghan elites and ordinary people, is on the line. And I think that in and of itself is an opportunity for a kind of coherence to emerge. Now, that will depend on the leadership of the Afghan government. It will depend on the continued courage of my friends in Afghanistan who keep standing up for their particular system of governance. And I think it also, there are many opportunities still for the Americans and our international partners, many points of leverage that still exist, but also a real responsibility, I believe, to take stock of what our role has been in creating this war. The Afghans did not ask us to come on September 12th to intervene in Kabul. The United States was attacked by a group that took sanctuary in Afghanistan with the support of the Taliban government. That is the reason the Americans went to war in Afghanistan, not to save Afghan women, not to bring democracy. Those are all perfectly good reasons that had existed in the 1990s, and they didn't really even register on the American political radar. So we need to be very clear about the fact that we started this war, the Americans, and we fought it in terms that consistently privileged our interests, our way of doing things, over those of our Afghan partners. And so as we prepare to exit, it seems only appropriate to acknowledge that responsibility and to make sure that we do the least harm on the way out.
Thanks, Dipali. Let me do this. I want to open it up to audience questions. So remind people that they can post a question in the chat feature of the video feed. We have several already. I want to, while those are being gathered and collated, I do want to turn back to Nader Nadri, maybe for your reactions to some of what Dipali was saying in terms of the difficulties of a republic, which is meant to reflect diversity of political and other views. You've probably felt that on the negotiating team, but I welcome your reactions for that. Obviously, they're in the advance of the Istanbul conference, which is now canceled. Multiple plans came out of different Afghan political entities, whether it's the government or the High Council. So, you know, how has it been for you and the negotiating team to try to reconcile these competing visions within the Republic?
Well, thank you. A very good point. But before going to that, I want to emphasize on a point that Muqaddasa made on the gains. It's believed mostly outside that some of these values and liberties that we taught today as gains were non-existent, or people were not fighting for it prior to 2001. As Asib said, zoom out to the history also, not only to the country, but to the history. And the Taliban people were fighting for those values. and those were considered their own, not being brought from other places. And the communist regime, people were fighting for those values and went to presence, and so on as we go past both the women movement, but also those who have fought throughout the history for a long time for accountable governments, for democratic systems, for the checks and balances and separation of power and constitutional monarchy. So you go for long sets of issues and historical examples where those were local, those were very indigenous demands of our people, and therefore it's very appropriate to not consider it as only the gains of the past 20 years. There's no doubt that with the international interventions, the space were expanded. And therefore, that space allowed for these values to flourish further and to find more roots in different corners of the country. And as Hasib said, it's certainly not only as it's called, an urban phenomenon. While the demography of our different geography have changed significantly, the urban ruler, but also these are things that people cherish and would stand for it and work for it post international withdrawals also, and they would fight for it. Now, on the question of representing the Republic, a challenge, it's certainly, but it's also a privilege, and that's what makes us different there. We have had on our side of the table, male, female, different ethnic representation, and an independence of expressing the voice and a statement when it was needed on certain principal issues. And that freedom of raising an opinion, while for the very common objective that the discipline was created before, and not anybody feeling restriction, was a demonstration of the beauty of this republic and the constitution that it operates based on. And therefore, at the same time, creating a sort of discipline where it's in line to the key work and methods of the negotiation, that you would try to keep things in order. You want to try to keep everything to go immediately, prevent that to go to the public, because that would also undermine a process of talks if those are sensitive issues before agreed. That sort of discipline is also a challenge. And the diversity of political spectrum and interest and keeping all of them in line was at times difficult, but not on certain key issues. As an example, for 2 weeks, we discussed different peace proposals, different mechanisms that were tabled by the different political actors. And it's in any democracy where political actors will come with opinions, with the different plans. And that should not be considered as very divisive. Those plans need to come around a certain consolidation, around key objectives for the future and key principles about the future. And I was not surprised, but very much delighted that throughout a week of work in a committee here in Kabul, the different political leaders were sitting, and I was part of it, and we were talking to consolidate one plan. There were consensus almost on every single element of a democratic Afghanistan. And there was no difference of opinion. But of course, there were differences about what form of governance in terms of a centralized or decentralized we need to have. Or is there a need for a transitional government or a peace government that would lead through an election to a transition and full political integration of the Taliban or of political settlement? Those were fundamental issues, but those were healthy discussions and not rejecting each other. And a full consensus I found among all the actors on election, the notion of election, and the future of governance need to come through an elected leader and elected institutions. On the rights and freedoms, the Bill of Rights chapter of the Constitution has the full consensus of every actor, even including Hizb Islam. So that's an issue of strength and made us throughout the process much more stronger on the table to negotiate peace as we were talking with the Taliban. Now, the question today for us, the clarity is there. The country is ours. There are certain institutions in place, including our national defense and security forces. We need to further strengthen them, and they defend not an individual, not a person, not a government, but they defend, and they are responsible to defend the Constitution. Certain forces, the diversity that we see in them, the special operation forces, the diversity of them, the commitment to the values of the Constitution are a source of strength, and we need to be optimistic about them. Challenges are there, certainly significant amount in terms of future financial support of them and sustainability of those expenditure is an issue. But also institutions of civil society, the human rights activists, the civil society activists, women leaders, that they are not anymore talking only about women's rights. They are a movement talking about their place in the overall big picture of this country and society, and they will not be silent, and they would continue to push. For our political leaders and the government, it's a moment that one could also look at, that could it be a moment of Churchill for the political leaders? A unity of different political oppositions and everybody coming together, but also creating a space for decisive decision-making. That will also be an enabling to make sure that a shared future could be made possible through continuous pursuit of peace talks with the Taliban.
Thank you for that. Let me now turn to some of the questions that have been coming in through the chat. First of all, Nick Bing says from Voice of America, what is your views on the March Troika statement? So that's the Moscow conference, which included the US, China, Pakistan, and Russia. Is that a departure from the Trump administration approach? What are the pros and cons of bringing China and Russia into the process? And maybe I would just build on that to invite comments, maybe first from Nader and to Laurel and others if they want, about the regional implications of this change in policy. With US troops out, of course, some of the neighbors of Afghanistan have wanted that for a long time. But it presumably affects the dynamics of both the conflict and the incentives to get to peace. And I wonder, first, Nader, from you, what are your thoughts on that? And then maybe turning to Laurel.
Sure. I was in Moscow when the Troika extended met, and the declaration was certainly a very welcomed declaration. Especially with re-emphasis on the future form of government and the non-acceptance of the Emirates. But at the same time, we understand that Afghanistan is in a very complex region. The strategic goal of each of our neighbor is slightly different or completely different from others, and also in most parts they are different from our strategic end goal of our people. The diplomatic approach to bring and consolidate the different conflicting interests and bring them into a common objective of at least preventing a long-term conflict and civil war in the country is a welcomed one, and that must continue. But with the announcement of the withdrawal, some of the calculation in the region certainly changed and changing. As an example, Russia certainly wanted to see the United States go, and therefore their calculus in providing certain support to certain groups may change. Iran has also a different look at Afghanistan. We continuously heard from Foreign Minister Zarif that a democratic, stable Afghanistan that's in peace with itself is a goal that they pursue. But we also understand that they've been supporting certain elements of the Taliban. Now, that calculus is changing also once the United States is out. China just announced a dramatic change and shift in the policy, at least in response if the vacuum is created, that their role to provide security is assisted. So that we have to wait and to see that this shifting ground, once it's settling, that more clarity will be created. But on Pakistan, I don't think anything would have changed or changing. They remain on course. They continued talking to the United States and promising things, and they've engaged on certain issues in support of the United States in relation with the Taliban's negotiation. But mostly they remain in support of this one path, that the continuation of Taliban in exerting military pressure and increasing violence. With the recent changes in Pakistan, the social unrest that they've seen, the economic downturn that they see and face, would they see a calculation differently, that now it's a time to nudge, to pressure, and to convince the Taliban to come to a peaceful settlement that will be in benefit of them and in the region. So the complexity will continue to remain. A fear is that countries do not go back to the 90s, shall not go, and there is potential for it, where they will choose their own proxies to continue pursuing their strategic goal in Afghanistan. If that path is to be chosen, the difficulty of a settlement will become even more complex, but also the issue of decline and decrease in the level of violence will be not something that one could be optimistic for it in short term.
Thank you. Laurel, can I ask you basically the same question about the regional picture after the
Yeah. I mean, first, I just wanted to say I really appreciate and think it's important, the discussion that we had on the protecting the gains, preserving the gains framing. And the reason is, it's partly because Muqaddesa and Nader have reminded those who may need to be reminded that Afghan history doesn't begin and end with the American invasion, but also because I think it's an important corrective to the reality that what at least partly what a lot of donors and outside actors really mean when they say preserving the gains is they mean preserving my investment in those gains. Like, I bought and paid for them, and therefore I need to make sure that my investment is not wasted. And, this is why this rhetoric comes a lot from political motivation. Not to say that there aren't some who genuinely believe it too, but I think they've offered an important corrective there. On the regional dimension, it was notable that President Biden in his speech about the withdrawal emphasized this himself. So it comes from the top in terms of how the U.S. is thinking about the future of diplomacy related to Afghanistan. I think you could look at what he said in a couple of ways. One is kind of cynically, you could say, what the U.S. is really saying is, we're done with this, over to you, Afghanistan's region. You could also look at it as an actually realistic appraisal of what it's going to take in order for there to be some prospect of negotiated political settlement in Afghanistan. I think it's largely the latter, because this is based on a realistic appraisal of what it's going to take. But there might be a little bit of the former mixed into it as well. And I think the American calculation here, and others have observed the same thing, is that there's really no prospect of a negotiated settlement and of enduring stability in Afghanistan unless Afghanistan's neighbors and near neighbors are on board with that they are pushing for it, at least if not collectively, pointing in the same direction, and that they are then supportive of any kind of outcome of political negotiation. But what this really means is that, I think we need to not think of this in terms of this group of countries just sort of getting together. We need to think about it in terms of what is the idea that they could focus any simultaneous, if not collective, action on. And I think what it fundamentally comes down to at this stage is, are these countries going to oppose and take steps to oppose an outright Taliban military victory in Afghanistan? Are they going to refrain from, in the absence of American military presence on the ground? Are they going to refrain from stepping up or even maintaining the level of support that some have provided to the Taliban, so that they're not putting their thumbs on the scales? And essentially, you know, are they really going to use influence with the Taliban to come to some terms here? Because that is, at this stage, the fundamental obstacle to reaching any kind of political settlement. And, you know, to my mind, the jury is out on whether you're going to see a kind of real centering on that idea, even though all of the countries in question, I mean, I'm setting aside India, which is in a different category on this, but among the other countries, I think, you know, they all say, we don't believe there should be unilateral Taliban control of the country and monopoly on power, but what do they all really mean behind that? And more importantly, what would they just sort of settle for? So I think it's absolutely right and realistic, and again, based on a realistic appraisal of the dynamics, that there be a focus on the regional diplomacy, on trying to get these countries to work in the same direction. And I agree that this should be a centerpiece of American and other diplomacy, and certainly of what Afghan authorities themselves try to do in rallying support. But I also think we have to have very modest expectations of the likelihood that this particular group of countries comes together in some collective or consensus-based fashion, because the dynamics among this group of countries is so difficult that my expectations of concerted positive action by this group are really quite modest.
Thanks. Let me go to another question from a viewer named Shugla. Asks, what role can the young generation play in the anticipated political and social, I guess, turmoil after the decision? Do Afghans feel divided on the decision of the U.S. To withdraw by September 2021? So maybe I'll just tack on to that a question that I was wanting to ask as well of the Afghan participants here, who are all leaders of what you could say is the next generation, or the post-2000, came to leadership roles after 2001. And I am curious, we've rejected a few divisions and divides here, so I'll give an opportunity to confirm or reject another one, a generational one. But when you look at both youth, which is the majority of, I think, Afghanistan's population now, younger than you all, and you all as new leaders, do you see contrasts between their desires and the older generation that have been so prevalent in talks, and how, if there are differences, how can the views of the next generation be better represented? Sorry, that was an open-ended question to all three people. Let me maybe start with Muqaddesa and then go to Hasib and see if Nader has thoughts at the end.
Thank you, Scott. I think what I tried to do earlier was probably an attempt, in terms of an attempt to correct framing, was probably me trying to do my part, as somebody who has had the honor and the opportunity to probably to have this platform, and to be able to speak a bigger audience who both have interest but probably are also important stakeholder when it comes to the issue of the conflict in Afghanistan. I think as grim as things are, the couple of people or friends that I have talked to in the past weeks since the announcement of the withdrawal, we all believe that an important opportunity has also presented itself to Afghanistan. I think the opportunity to finally take matters on our own hands. I think the path is not going to be an easy one, especially that our institutions, and I think generally there's a culture of dependency has grown over the past 20 years here, a dependency and also a culture of outsourcing your decision and the consequences of those decisions, to the foreigner. And just to give you an example, it was amazing for me that for how long, the National Unity Government was actually referred to as the government of Ambassador of John Kerry here, so I think that's a good example of how the long standing engagement of the international community in Afghanistan has created this culture of dependency and also a culture of outsourcing your decisions. So I think the current vacuum of potential international community withdrawal does provide opportunity for the younger generation to try to put their skills at use. But I think, having said that, it's also important that the Afghan government also tries to actively use this opportunity, mobilize support, and also create that space, for the younger generation to be able to put their skills and expertise in use. A lot of the youth who are employed in the private sector or who are leading businesses, many of them that I have spoken to over the past week, I haven't heard from any of them, that they are planning to close down their business and move on. I think a lot of people are trying to understand how they could adjust themselves to the new reality of what might come. So I think very small examples, but I think those are potentially, avenues of engagement for the Afghan youth, I would say.
Thank you, Hasib. Let me get your comments.
Scott, on this question of the generational conversation and whether that could be solutions could be anticipated from it, or why not to look at it as essentially continuation of a 40 years of violence-ridden problematic period in our history. I think it really comes down to a metaphor I would apply to it is increasingly the hardware doesn't matter. It's what software or what operating system have you installed. So, and we have lived in the past decade with a situation where even our generation in particular, but the likes of us, but also even if you look at it on the other side, on the Talib side, you see a generational shift of some sorts coming forward. And the risk is, is the operating system the same? Are they using an old operating system on new hardware? Or is there a recognition that the times of 2021, we need to undo the very violence-ridden ethos and ways of going about life that we have unfortunately gotten used to in the past 40 years, in particular in politics. That has become, so to me, increasingly, it's no longer a question of does it matter if somebody is young or old, but it matters whether they're operating with a new operating system or they're just, the hardware is new, the software is downloaded from some old, increasingly irrelevant operating system or coding system.
I can't resist going to Dipali to ask, having written a book on strongmen in Afghanistan, do you think there's a capability of new software being downloaded or not?
My friend Nader May and I have had this conversation many times. I absolutely do. I mean, I think one of the things that is really important to underscore is Muqaddas' point about the kind of backdrop, the givens I've been traveling to Afghanistan and working, with colleagues there since 2004. And so much of these ideas and these imperatives, as Nader said, were very much already within the society. The issue was just that the West was not engaging with Afghanistan on those terms until after 2001. But one thing that's very striking to me is, my work is with, my research has been about a set of actors very different from our friends who are on this call, but even among them, I think there's a really striking kind of recognition that life during war is profoundly difficult. And many of those, and I think it's important to say that it's easy, again, to create many different tensions, as you've elaborated, Scott, X versus Y, A versus B. But I think the broad constituency who are invested not just in the Republican system, but really in a peaceful Afghanistan, that cannot be understated, including those who fought for many, many years, you know, from the 1970s onward. The last point I just want to make about your comment about the next generation, I've been very fortunate to have developed very close friendships and partnerships with many members of that generation, and can say, and I think this bears underscoring for our American audience, one opportunity that comes from the troop withdrawal is to begin to think about the Afghan government, but more importantly, the Afghan citizenry as our partners, our teachers, our collaborators, our friends, those who share a set of values that are actually, you know, hard to find in the region, frankly, of pluralism, of accommodation, of inclusion, and just of remarkable political courage, but also deep strides in higher education, in research, in art, in the arts, in the media. And so that there are real opportunities for us to recognize, rather than, as Laurel was saying, we are the donor, they are the recipient, we bring the change, they accept our help, instead to really reframe our understanding of it as a genuine partnership from which we have a great deal to gain. I can say for myself, that's been my own experience for the 2 decades that I've been engaged myself.
Great point, thanks. I want to ask one closing question, but Nader, do you want to get in on this conversation as well?
Well, certainly. What kind of an Afghanistan we want to see, and a peaceful Afghanistan would require all of its reality to be into one basket. They're contradictory realities. The former warlords and commanders, the old leaders of different walks of life, the Taliban, and the younger generation that is part of this transformed Afghanistan. All of them are realities. And then we need to see how they can work together, not one at the cost of the other, but all to work together to chart that new future and shared future that we are looking at. And then when we talk about that aspects of leadership, that we must have certain indicators to see that a future that could be built like this and that would require certain elements of on all of these leaders to be considered leaders, that they would then mobilize their constituencies to a common vision or a common or a shared future. That's where most of our international partners have worked against bringing all of this together. There's been a tendency there were certain names of the past. Those certain names, as the USIP say, may have downloaded certain new operating system also. The vocabulary have changed, the attire may change, but the level of their constituency and followers would not be the same level as the USIPs or Muqaddasa or other younger leaders. And therefore, the international community, especially in the past 2 years, we've been first-hand witness of this, to press against the emergence and the upward mobility of the new generation of leaders to be considered as decision makers, not the ones who are being ballooned or who are the ones who, as the USIP says, a new hardware, old software is there. But there are many others, and I've seen firsthand that when there was a critical decision, even about the Istanbul conference as an example, critical decision for the future of this country needed to be made, only names were considered without a proper assessment of who can then mobilize certain constituencies to accept the outcome and to own the outcome. And isn't the time that we need to balance between what are the potential leaders of the past and what are the new leaders of today's Afghanistan, and how they both could also balance each other and to get an outcome where a majority of the younger generation of Afghans could accept, and majority of the population of Afghanistan could accept. Those who live under the Republic's flag and those who live under the Taliban flag. That must be elements of putting the leaders together, or indicators for the leaders of today or future.
Well, thank you very much for that. You know, I look to end Afghan events on a positive note always, and I'm going to take that as the positive note to end this discussion on. We are at time. I really appreciate all of the panelists' time. I appreciate the time of the audience. This event will be available on USIP's website as well afterwards if you want to refer it to others. You know, let me just conclude my remark with a remark from me about a contrast that I do think is stark, and I think the panelists might agree, and that is the contrast between the Taliban's use of force to get their views across, which probably do not represent a majority of Afghans, and the views that have been expressed here, which is that for all of its diversity, Afghanistan has changed, has a lot of common positions, despite maybe surface level disagreements. And the contrast between the democratic system that the Afghans have adopted and the use of force is extremely stark right now. So I'm hoping that the peace process, number one, will continue, but also can continue in a way that does reflect indeed the true diversity of views, but also the weight of those views in terms of how popular they are and how many people they represent. So with that, let me just say thank you to all of the panelists, and we hope that you will come back to USIP for future events on discussing the peace process.